The Altitude of Integrity. Chapter 1. Clouded Skies. Ava Reynolds had witnessed inequality before, the subtle slights and the overt prejudices that stain the fabric of everyday life. On this seemingly routine transcontinental flight, a single, jarring incident threatened to expose deeply ingrained biases and irrevocably alter the course of Ava's life, and perhaps the lives of those around her. Would standing firm for what was right cost her everything she held dear? Or would truth and justice ultimately prevail in the end, piercing through the clouds of prejudice like a ray of defiant sunlight? Where are you watching from today? We'd love to know. Ava Reynolds walked with practiced grace down the slender aisle of the Boeing 737. The polished navy blue of her sensible heels clicked softly against the carpeted floor, a rhythmic cadence that was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The air, a carefully balanced blend of recycled oxygen and artificial fragrance, hung with the faint, comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee, a sensory cocktail that had become synonymous with travel, with new beginnings, with the endless possibilities that lay waiting at the journey's end. She carefully straightened the cuffs of her crisp, white blouse, her gaze sweeping across the rows of passengers with the keen, almost intuitive perception of someone who had spent years honing the ability to decipher unspoken emotions and assess personalities in mere seconds. Ava knew how to read people. It was a skill she had learned early on, a survival mechanism in a world that often judged before it understood. In seat 3A, Damon Sterling sat quietly, his long, slender fingers resting gently on his lap, a seemingly unconscious gesture that spoke volumes about his inherent composure. The expertly tailored charcoal gray suit draped perfectly across his broad shoulders, the subtle sheen of his silk tie catching the soft glow of the cabin lights. Damon's mother, God rest her soul, had instilled in him the importance of presenting oneself with dignity and self-respect, a lesson he had embraced wholeheartedly. "How you carry yourself," she had often said, her voice gentle but firm, "dictates how the world perceives you, son." It was a mantra he lived by. The world, however, often chose to see only what it wanted to see, filtering perception through the distorting lens of its own preconceived notions. Across the aisle, in seat 3B, Arthur Finch barely managed to settle himself before he began to fidget and shift, his mouth twisting into a mask of barely suppressed annoyance. His voice, sharp and tinged with an unearned sense of entitlement, sliced through the muted hum of conversation like a shard of glass. "Excuse me," he snapped, clicking his fingers dismissively at Ava, as if she were a lowly waiter at his exclusive country club. "There's a bit of an issue here." Ava approached Arthur Finch with the same calm, professional demeanor that characterized all of her interactions. "Is there something I can assist you with, sir?" she asked, her tone even and polite. Arthur gestured impatiently in Damon's direction, his lip curling into a sneer of open disgust. "I don't know what's going on, but there's a smell. It's unbearable. I can't possibly sit next to this." He trailed off, the unspoken word hanging heavy in the air. Damon blinked slowly, deliberately, a nearly imperceptible inhale preceding a lifetime of practiced self-control. He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking with Ava's. There was no visible anger in his gaze, no outward display of emotion, only the quiet, weary resignation of a man who had encountered this scenario before countless times in different settings with different faces, but always with the same underlying prejudice. Ava stiffened, her fingers curling into tight fists at her sides before she consciously forced them to relax. "Sir, I can assure you, there is no discernible odor," she stated, her voice carefully modulated. Arthur let out a harsh, derisive laugh, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. "I'm not imagining things. Just move him. It's that simple." A fleeting expression, unreadable and fleeting, flickered across Damon's face. He averted his gaze from Arthur, looking out the small oval window, as if trying to gauge the impossible distance between himself and the vast expanse of the sky, between himself and the freedom he could not find on the ground. Ava's voice remained firm, unwavering, but calm. "We don't move passengers without a valid reason, sir. And there is no valid reason in this case." The words themselves were simple, factual, yet they carried a weighty significance, pressing into the palpable tension like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of unease throughout the immediate vicinity. Nearby passengers shifted in their seats, some pointedly pretending not to eavesdrop, while others watched with undisguised curiosity, their eyes darting back and forth between Arthur, Damon, and Ava, like spectators at a silent, unsettling tennis match. Arthur's expression darkened, his features hardening into a mask of haughty indignation. "I want to speak to someone in charge. This is ridiculous." Ava held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer, her resolve hardening, before offering a tight, professional nod. "Certainly, sir. I'll call my supervisor." She turned, her heart pounding a steady, insistent rhythm against her ribs. She had witnessed injustice before countless times. She had even been forced, on occasion, to look the other way, to swallow her own moral compass in the name of expediency or self-preservation. But not today. Not this time. Chapter 2. Escalation in the air. The supervisor, a man named Mr. Walker, arrived with an air of weary authority, his posture radiating a carefully cultivated blend of concern and impatience. His pressed gray suit seemed a size too tight, as if he were perpetually bracing himself for conflict. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, his voice a low rumble, "what seems to be the issue, sir?" Walker was a man who knew how to navigate the treacherous waters of customer service. He had learned that diplomacy and a placating tone could often defuse even the most volatile situations. Arthur pointed an accusing finger directly at Damon, his face contorted with indignation. "This man smells awful. It's completely ruining my flight. I'm simply asking for some basic comfort here. Move him." Walker sighed inwardly, his gaze flicking briefly between Ava and Damon before settling, somewhat reluctantly, on Arthur. He knew the type, privileged, entitled, and accustomed to getting his own way, regardless of the cost to others. "Sir, we don't move passengers unless there is a legitimate reason to do so," Walker replied, his tone carefully neutral. Arthur scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. "I'm giving you a legitimate reason. Do I need to escalate this further? Do you want me to call corporate and complain? Because I assure you I will." Walker hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but Ava saw it. The almost imperceptible flicker of doubt in his eyes, the mental calculation of potential consequences. She could almost hear the unspoken thoughts racing through his mind. Was it easier to simply remove Damon and appease the irate, wealthy customer, or to stand firm and risk a potentially damaging complaint? "Sir," Ava interjected, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the escalating tension. "If there were an actual issue, we would, of course, address it immediately. But there isn't. Mr. Sterling deserves the same respect and consideration as every other passenger on this flight." Walker's lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. He shot Ava a warning glance, a silent reprimand for her audacity. "Ava," Damon finally spoke, his voice calm, even, and surprisingly devoid of emotion. "Let him finish his performance. I want to see how this plays out. I'm curious to see just how far he's willing to take this charade." Arthur's face flushed a deeper shade of red, his eyes narrowing with anger. "What did you just say to me?" Damon met his accusatory gaze, his expression unwavering. "You want me to move because you believe I don't belong here, that I'm somehow inferior to you. But the truth is, your discomfort stems from something far more profound. You're uncomfortable with me simply existing in this space, with the mere fact of my presence challenging your deeply ingrained prejudices." A hush fell over the entire section of the first-class cabin. Passengers leaned forward, their ears straining to catch every word, every nuance of the unfolding drama. Arthur opened his mouth to retort, then abruptly snapped it shut, suddenly aware of the intense scrutiny of the many eyes fixed upon him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado visibly crumbling under the weight of public attention. Walker cleared his throat loudly, attempting to regain control of the situation. I think it's best if we all return to our seats and proceed with the flight. There's no need to cause any further disturbance. Arthur huffed in exasperation, but grudgingly fell silent, slumping back into his chair. He glared at Damon, then at Ava, his eyes burning with resentment. Damon exhaled slowly, deliberately, his fingers relaxing their grip on the armrest. He offered Ava the smallest, most subtle of nods, a silent acknowledgement of her courage and integrity. Ava returned the nod, her heart still pounding, before turning to resume her duties. But she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within her bones, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Not yet. Chapter 3. Above the Clouds. Beneath the surface. Damon Sterling kept his gaze fixed on the small window, watching the world stretch out far below him, a tapestry of fields and forests, of cities and rivers, all rendered insignificant by the vastness of the sky. He had been in this position before, countless times. The slow, insidious crawl of prejudice, the unspoken expectation of compliance, the weary resignation that came with being judged not by the content of his character, but by the color of his skin. But something about today felt different. The silence that surrounded him was charged with an almost palpable energy, a waiting game suspended in the thin air above the clouds. He could feel the weight of unspoken opinions, the subtle shifts in perspective, the quiet struggle between apathy and empathy. Ava moved past him, her movements fluid and efficient, her hands steady as she attended to the needs of the other passengers. She had made her decision, taken her stand, and there was no turning back now. A quiet, nagging voice whispered in the back of her mind, questioning the wisdom of her actions, wondering if she had jeopardized her career, her reputation, her future. But another part of her, stronger and steadier, knew that some moments in life demanded a response, a refusal to be complicit in injustice. Some lines simply could not be crossed. Walker's mind was racing. He had been in the airline business for over 20 years, and he knew the intricate, often unforgiving rules of the game. Appease the wrong passenger, and the ensuing backlash could be swift and devastating. But make the wrong call in a situation like this, and it could cost him far more than just his job. It could cost him his integrity, his self-respect. Passengers around them exchanged furtive glances, their eyes darting back and forth between Arthur and Damon, like spectators at a high-stakes poker game. Some clearly sided with Ava, their quiet nods of approval barely perceptible. Others looked away, their faces carefully blank, too accustomed to ignoring the kind of subtle, insidious injustice that was playing out before their very eyes. They had learned long ago that it was easier to remain silent, to avoid confrontation, to simply go along to get along. Then, from the back of the first-class cabin, a voice rang out, clear and firm. "I think he deserves an apology." All heads turned, swiveling in unison like synchronized automatons. A woman in her late 60s, her silver hair pulled back neatly into a sophisticated bun, sat upright in her seat, her eyes fixed on Arthur with a look of unwavering disapproval. She turned her gaze to Walker, then to Ava, her expression softening slightly. "I've been flying for 30 years, she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded attention. "And I've never seen someone so openly humiliated, so casually thrown under the bus for simply speaking the truth." Another passenger, a businessman in a navy blue suit that almost perfectly mirrored Damon's, folded his arms across his chest and nodded in agreement. "Yeah, this isn't right. The guy hasn't done anything wrong." Arthur bristled, his face contorting with renewed anger. "Mind your own business," he snapped, his voice dripping with venom. Damon let out a slow, deliberate breath, tilting his head slightly as he surveyed the unfolding scene. "Seems like my business just got a lot bigger." Walker swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. The tide was shifting, he could feel it. The weight of public opinion was beginning to coalesce, threatening to overwhelm him. He turned to Ava, his expression strained. "Ms. Reynolds, you're not going anywhere." And just like that, the moment changed. Not entirely, not permanently, but just enough. Damon smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. And Ava stood a little taller, her shoulders squared. Her resolve strengthened. Chapter 4. Descent into Reality. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway at Los Angeles International Airport. The familiar bump and rumble signaling the end of the flight, but the tension in the cabin remained thick and palpable. It hung in the air like a dense fog, clinging to the passengers, suffocating the usual sense of relief and anticipation that accompanied arrival. Damon Sterling sat motionless, his hands resting calmly on his lap, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding outside the window. He watched as ground crew scurried about, as baggage handlers unloaded luggage, as the world outside the plane began to awaken. He was a keen observer, a master of detachment, able to analyze situations and people with a dispassionate clarity that often surprised those who knew him well. Across the aisle, Arthur Finch avoided his gaze entirely, his fingers gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He seemed to shrink into himself, his earlier arrogance replaced by a palpable sense of discomfort and shame. Ava Reynolds stood by the exit, her posture straight and professional, her expression carefully unreadable. She had done what she believed was right, acted according to her own moral code, and she couldn't regret that. But she also knew that standing up for what was right often came with consequences, that challenging the status quo could be a risky and isolating endeavor. The weight of uncertainty sat heavily on her shoulders, a leaden burden that threatened to drag her down. As the seatbelt sign blinked off, a uniformed airline representative stepped onto the plane, his eyes scanning the first-class section with a practiced efficiency. He walked directly toward Damon, extending a hand with a respectful nod. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice composed but firm, "we've been expecting you." A murmur rippled through the surrounding passengers, a collective gasp of surprise and speculation. Arthur's grip on the armrest tightened, his face paling as the realization began to dawn on him. Damon stood up, adjusting his suit jacket with a casual air of authority. He met the airline representative's handshake with a firm grip and a warm smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm but carrying a quiet power. "I appreciate you meeting me." Arthur blinked, his jaw slack with disbelief. You know him?" he stammered, looking back and forth between Damon and the airline representative, his voice barely above a whisper. The representative's expression remained neutral, betraying nothing. "Yes, sir. This is Mr. Damon Sterling, the CEO of this airline." A stunned silence followed, a moment of absolute stillness in which time seemed to stand still. Ava's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing to process the implications of this unexpected revelation. The entire first-class section seemed frozen in place, each passenger struggling to reconcile their previous assumptions with this new, undeniable truth. Arthur's face turned a deep shade of crimson, his arrogance and entitlement crumbling before everyone's eyes. He stammered, his voice cracking with embarrassment. Damon turned toward Ava, his expression softening, his eyes filled with a genuine warmth. "I heard about what happened earlier," he said, his tone sincere, "and I want to personally thank you for standing up for what was right. Your courage and integrity are deeply appreciated." Ava nodded, still slightly in shock, but a wave of relief began to wash over her, dissipating the anxiety that had been gnawing at her. "I was just doing my job, sir," she replied, her voice regaining its composure. Damon's eyes held a knowing look. "Not everyone would have done what you did, Ms. Reynolds. Not everyone is willing to risk their own comfort for the sake of justice." He turned back to the airline representative, his tone shifting back to one of command. "Ensure that Ms. Ava Reynolds is commended for her actions. I want her to receive a formal recognition for her exemplary service." The representative nodded promptly. "Of course, sir. It will be done immediately." Arthur swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't know," he began, his voice laced with desperation. But Damon raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "You didn't need to know who I was, Mr. Finch. Respect and decency shouldn't depend on status or wealth. You showed exactly who you are today, and that speaks volumes." Arthur opened his mouth to protest, to offer some kind of feeble excuse, but no words came out. He simply stood there, speechless and defeated, the weight of his own prejudice crushing him. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. As Damon and Ava stepped off the plane, a round of quiet applause broke out, rippling through the first-class section like a gentle wave. Ava inhaled deeply, feeling lighter than she had in hours. The tension that had been gripping her had finally dissipated, replaced by a sense of validation and purpose. Justice had been served, not through anger or retribution, but through truth and integrity. The powerful CEO of the airline had used his position to right a wrong, to acknowledge the importance of standing up against prejudice, no matter how subtle or insidious. Justice had prevailed this time, but Ava knew, with a sobering certainty, that injustice often went unnoticed, that countless acts of prejudice were committed every day, hidden beneath the surface of polite society. Ava paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the passengers deplaning behind her. Each one carried their own stories, their own biases, their own capacity for both good and evil. She wondered how many of them had learned something from what they had witnessed on the plane, how many would be more willing to stand up for what was right in the future. She hoped that her actions had made a difference, that they had planted a seed of awareness in the hearts of those who had witnessed the unfolding drama. Damon turned to her, a warm smile gracing his lips. "Thank you again, Ms. Reynolds. Your courage is an inspiration." Ava smiled back, her heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. It was an honor to serve you." As they walked through the terminal, Ava knew that her life had been irrevocably changed. She had stood up for what was right, and in the end, the truth had prevailed. But she also knew that the fight for justice was far from over, and that she would continue to use her voice, her actions, to make a difference in the world. This time, justice prevailed. But how many times does injustice go unnoticed? Ava stood up for what was right, and in the end, the truth won. But in real life, these moments happen every day. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your story. And if you enjoy powerful, emotional stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your voice matters, and together, we can make a difference.